You are 8 years old, standing in a cathedral that stretches impossibly high above your small frame. The stone beneath your bare feet is so cold it burns. Incense chokes the air, mixing with the metallic scent of fierce sweat from the hundreds of nobles packed into the shadows behind you. Your tiny hand trembles as a ring, heavy as a shackle, sized for a woman's finger, slides over your knuckles and dangles loose around your child's digit. The boy beside you cannot be older than 13, his own hands shaking as badly as yours. You are Agnes of France, and today you become Empress of the Byzantine Empire through marriage to a child who will be dead within months. The year is 1180 AD, and your childhood ends with the scrape of gold against bone. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The marriage contract had been signed when Agnes was still learning to walk properly, her destiny sealed by men who measured her worth in dowries and territorial claims. Born around 1071 AD to Louis VII of France and his third wife Adele of Champagne, Agnes entered the world as a political pawn before she drew her first breath. Her father, haunted by his failures in the Second Crusade, and desperate to maintain France's influence in the fractured medieval world, saw opportunity in the Byzantine Empire's offer of alliance through matrimony. Louis VII had spent his reign struggling with the consequences of his disastrous marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose subsequent union with Henry II of England had created the Angevin Empire, a territorial nightmare that threatened to swallow France whole. The Byzantine alliance represented a chance to outflank his English rivals, potentially opening a second front that might draw Plantagenet attention away from French borders. Agnes represented the price of this strategic gambit, her 8-year-old life wagered against territorial ambitions that stretched across continents. The negotiations that sealed Agnes's fate unfolded in the palace of the Ile de la Cité, where French courtiers met with Byzantine ambassadors to discuss terms that would determine a child's future without consulting her preferences or considering her welfare. The Byzantine delegation arrived bearing gifts that demonstrated their empire's legendary wealth: silk textiles that shimmered like captured light, spices that perfumed entire rooms with exotic fragrances, and manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf that caught candlelight and threw it back in dazzling reflections. Manuel Komnenos, the Byzantine emperor, needed Western allies to counter the growing threat from Seljuk Turks who pressed steadily against his eastern borders. His empire, though still magnificent, showed signs of the weakness that would eventually prove fatal. Provincial governors demonstrated increasing independence, while Italian maritime republics carved out trading privileges that effectively colonized Byzantine commerce. A marriage alliance with France offered potential military support and diplomatic legitimacy at a time when both were desperately needed. The formal betrothal ceremony took place in the chapel of the French royal palace, where 7-year-old Agnes stood beside ambassadors who spoke for an absent bridegroom she had never seen. The Byzantine delegation presented her with a miniature crown set with pearls from the Black Sea, its weight causing her small neck to bow forward as palace officials recorded the legal formalities that would govern her life. Canon law required her consent, but the question posed to a 7-year-old child represented mockery rather than meaningful choice. Agnes spent her final year in France receiving education deemed appropriate for a future Byzantine empress. Greek tutors arrived from Constantinople to teach her the language of her new homeland. Their lessons conducted in palace chambers where the sound of declining conjugations mixed with the winter wind rattling diamond-paned windows. She learned to eat with the golden utensils favoured by Byzantine nobility, to walk with the measured dignity expected of imperial women, and to recognize the religious icons that decorated every surface of her future palace. Religious instruction formed a crucial component of her preparation, as the theological differences between Western and Eastern Christianity created potential complications for a Latin princess in an Orthodox empire. French priests explained the filioque controversy with careful diplomacy, describing how Eastern and Western churches disagreed about whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone or from both Father and Son. These abstract theological disputes meant little to a child, but they would shape every religious observance of her coming years. Physical preparation proved equally important, as Byzantine court protocols differed dramatically from the relatively informal customs of French nobility. Agnes learned to prostrate herself before religious icons, to maintain rigid posture during lengthy ceremonial functions, and to modulate her voice to the whisper-soft tones considered appropriate for imperial women. Palace dance masters taught her the stately movements required for state occasions, while seamstresses created miniature versions of Byzantine court dress that would allow her to practice moving in the heavy silk garments that would soon become her daily uniform. Constantinople in 1179 AD pulsed with a different kind of power than the crude stone fortresses of Western Europe. Here, silk replaced rough wool, and the emperor's palace sprawled across 7 hills like a glittering spider's web of marble and gold. When the French delegation arrived carrying 8-year-old Agnes across thousands of miles of rutted roads and churning seas, they found an empire already rotting from within. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos had died the previous year, leaving behind his young son Alexios II, a boy barely old enough to hold a sword, much less rule an empire that stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Anatolia. The journey itself had taken months, carrying Agnes through landscapes that changed like chapters in an illuminated manuscript. From the familiar fields of northern France, through the wine country of Burgundy where autumn leaves created carpets of gold and crimson beneath their horses' hooves, into the alpine passes where snow fell in May and the air grew thin enough to make breathing difficult, through the Italian peninsula where classical ruins spoke of empires that had risen and fallen before her ancestors learned to write their names. The sea crossing from Venice to Constantinople proved particularly traumatic for a child who had never seen water deeper than the Seine. Mediterranean storms tossed their galley like a child's toy, sending everyone aboard into bouts of retching that left the deck slippery with vomit and seawater. Agnes spent 3 days in her cabin, too seasick to eat, while French diplomats debated whether to turn back or continue toward a destination that seemed increasingly impossible to reach. When Constantinople's famous skyline finally emerged from morning mist, Agnes pressed her face against the ship's rail to glimpse her new home. The city spread before her like something from the illustrated books of hours she had studied in France, its domes and towers catching sunlight and throwing it back in colours that seemed too brilliant for reality. The Golden Horn stretched like a curved dagger into the city's heart, its waters crowded with vessels from every corner of the known world. Venetian galleys heavy with spices, Genoese traders loaded with precious metals, and fishing boats whose nets held the silver catch that fed the imperial capital. The palace itself defied every expectation. Where French royal residences emphasized defensive strength, the Byzantine palace sprawled in magnificent vulnerability across its 7 hills. Marble columns supported roofs that seemed to float weightlessly above courtyards where fountains played music with falling water. Gardens stretched beyond the horizon, their geometric patterns interrupted by pavilions where silk curtains stirred in breezes that carried the scent of roses and jasmine from thousands of miles away. Agnes's first meeting with Alexios II took place in the palace's throne room, a space so vast that whispers echoed like shouts and footsteps clicked against marble floors that reflected like mirrors. The boy emperor sat upon the throne of Constantine, his feet dangling several inches above the ground while the purple imperial diadem slipped constantly down over his eyes. Palace officials had dressed him in silk robes that puddled around his thin frame, creating the impression of a child playing dress-up in adult clothing. The formal introduction followed Byzantine protocol that required both children to recite scripted phrases in Greek, while hundreds of courtiers observed their every gesture. Agnes, her voice barely audible in the enormous space, spoke words she had memorized without understanding, while Alexios responded with equal mechanical precision. Neither child looked directly at the other during this ceremony, their eyes fixed on palace officials who prompted them through gestures whenever their recitation faltered. Following the introduction came a feast that demonstrated the empire's legendary wealth while highlighting the contrast between Eastern and Western customs. Course followed course in endless succession, wines from Cyprus and Rhodes, fruits preserved in honey from Trebizond, and delicacies whose very names were foreign to French ears. Agnes sat beside Alexios at the high table, both children overwhelmed by the attention focused upon them, while adult conversations swirled in languages they recognized but did not fully comprehend. The wedding ceremony itself defied every natural instinct. Agnes, dressed in Byzantine silk that pulled around her feet like spilled wine, could barely see over the altar. The crown they placed on her head kept sliding down over her eyes, its weight pressing against her skull until her neck ached. Alexios II, pale and thin from the chronic illness that would soon claim his life, swayed slightly as he stood beside her. Neither child understood the Greek words of the Orthodox ceremony, though Agnes had been hastily taught to nod at certain phrases and extend her hand when prompted. The Orthodox marriage service differed dramatically from the Latin ceremonies. Agnes knew from France. Instead of the straightforward vows familiar to Western Christianity, the Byzantine ritual involved complex symbolism that referenced theological concepts far beyond a child's understanding. The priest crowned both bride and groom with golden stepana connected by a single ribbon, symbolizing their spiritual unity in a ceremony that would have been meaningful for adults capable of grasping its significance. Palace musicians played instruments. Agnes had never heard the haunting notes of Aulus flutes mixing with the rhythmic clatter of castanets and the deep thrumming of drums whose skins had been stretched over frames carved from exotic woods. The music created an otherworldly atmosphere that made the ceremony feel like a dream from which she might eventually wake, though the weight of gold against her skull provided constant reminder that this transformation was irreversibly real. In the crowd of assembled dignitaries, whispers carried like poison through the incense-heavy air. The real power in Constantinople belonged to Andronicus I Komnenos, the emperor's cousin, whose dark eyes followed the ceremony with calculating intensity. At nearly 60 years old, Andronicus had spent decades in exile for his various rebellions and romantic scandals, but Manuel's death had created the perfect vacuum for his return. While two children played at being emperor and empress, he plotted the murder of one and the possession of the other. Andronicus's presence created an undercurrent of tension that even children could sense, though they lacked the experience to interpret its meaning. Palace servants moved differently when he appeared, their postures becoming more rigid while their eyes avoided direct contact. Courtiers who had been chatting comfortably fell silent when his footsteps echoed in distant corridors. Even the palace cats, usually confident in their dominion over marble halls, slunk away when his shadow fell across their paths. Agnes's wedding night consisted of sleeping in a bed larger than most peasant homes, with Alexios positioned decorously on the far side, both children uncomfortable and confused by the expectations pressing down upon them. Court physicians examined her monthly for signs of womanhood that would not come for years, while Byzantine nobles bowed to a girl who still sometimes forgot to curtsy in return. The palace eunuchs, those strange, smooth-faced men who wielded influence through whispered conversations and strategic gift-giving, watched her with calculating eyes, already measuring her potential usefulness in the power struggles to come. Palace life revolved around ceremonies that marked every hour of every day with rigid protocol. Agnes learned to wake before dawn for religious observances that began while stars still glittered above Constantinople's domes. Morning prayers in the palace chapel involved prostrations that left her knees bruised against marble floors, while evening vespers stretched until candles burned low in their golden sconces. Between these religious bookends, her days filled with lessons designed to transform a French princess into a Byzantine empress. Greek language instruction continued daily, though the dialect spoken in the palace differed significantly from the classical Greek of ancient texts. Agnes struggled with verb forms that had no equivalent in Latin, while her tutors demonstrated increasing frustration with her accent that marked her permanently as foreign. Writing lessons proved equally challenging, as Byzantine scribes employed calligraphic techniques that transformed simple letters into elaborate works of art requiring hours of practice to achieve even basic competence. Court etiquette demanded mastery of countless subtle gestures and vocal modulations that conveyed social relationships through non-verbal communication. Agnes learned to adjust her walking pace to match the rank of her companions, to modulate her voice to precisely the volume appropriate for addressing different categories of palace inhabitants, and to arrange her facial expressions to convey appropriate emotions during various ceremonial occasions. These lessons continued for hours each day, with palace officials correcting her posture, her tone, and her timing until every movement became calculated performance. Religious education formed another crucial component of her training, as Agnes needed to understand Orthodox theology well enough to participate meaningfully in ceremonies that would mark every significant occasion of her reign. Byzantine Christianity differed from Western Catholicism in ways that went far beyond the theological controversies that divided the churches. Icons played central roles in Eastern worship, their painted saints serving as windows into heavenly realms that believers could access through prayer and contemplation. Agnes learned to recognize dozens of saints by their symbolic attributes. Saint Basil with his episcopal vestments, Saint Chrysostom with his golden tongue, and the various martyrs whose suffering had earned them places in the celestial hierarchy. She memorized prayers whose Greek syllables felt foreign on her tongue, while palace chaplains explained theological concepts that assumed knowledge of philosophical traditions completely alien to Western European thought. The empire Agnes had married into was a shadow of its former glory. Once Byzantine eagles had soared over territories, stretching from Italy to the Euphrates River. By the time Agnes arrived, the empire struggled to control even Anatolia. The Fourth Crusade loomed on the horizon, though none could foresee how Western Christians would soon sack Constantinople itself. Seljuk Turks pressed from the east, while Norman adventurers carved out kingdoms in former Byzantine territories. The empire needed strong leadership, experienced generals, and unified purpose. Instead, it received a dying boy and a French child whose greatest political skill was looking appropriately solemn during religious ceremonies. Economic problems compounded military weaknesses, as the empire's financial resources had been steadily depleted by decades of costly warfare and diplomatic bribery. The imperial treasury, once legendary for its wealth, now struggled to pay the salaries of palace guards and civil servants. Provincial taxes arrived sporadically, when they arrived at all, as distant governors increasingly kept revenues for local purposes rather than forwarding them to Constantinople. Trade relationships that had once enriched the empire now served primarily to benefit Italian maritime republics, whose commercial privileges effectively colonized Byzantine commerce. Venetian and Genoese merchants controlled the most profitable trade routes, while Byzantine producers found themselves reduced to supplying raw materials that generated profits for foreign entrepreneurs. The empire that had once dominated Mediterranean commerce now existed as a client state of the very Western powers it had once patronized. Alexios II's illness manifested in coughing fits that echoed through the palace corridors, spatters of blood on silk handkerchiefs, quickly whisked away by servants who knew better than to acknowledge what they had seen. Agnes, still playing with dolls carved from ivory and dressed in miniature court gowns, found herself sitting beside her husband's sickbed, while physicians burned aromatic herbs and muttered prayers in languages she could not identify. The boy emperor would call for her sometimes during his fevered moments, and she would take his hot hand in her small one, neither child understanding the political machinations swirling around their arranged marriage. Palace physicians represented various medical traditions that reflected the empire's cosmopolitan heritage. Greek doctors trained in classical methods competed with Arab physicians whose knowledge of anatomy and pharmacology far exceeded European standards. Jewish medical practitioners tolerated, despite religious restrictions, brought diagnostic techniques learned in the hospitals of Cordoba and Baghdad. Their treatments for Alexios's condition ranged from bloodletting with silver lancets to herbal preparations whose ingredients had traveled across continents to reach Constantinople's markets. The boy emperor's increasing weakness created opportunities for those who had been waiting in the palace's shadows. Court officials who had bowed respectfully to Alexios began spending more time in private consultation with his potential successors. Palace guards demonstrated less enthusiasm for their duties, while servants showed increasing reluctance to follow orders that might later be countermanded by new authority. Even the palace cats seemed to sense the changing atmosphere, gathering in different parts of the complex as though seeking protection from approaching storms. Agnes watched these subtle shifts with the clarity of childhood observation, though she lacked the political sophistication to interpret their full significance. She noticed that certain courtiers no longer attended the emperor's morning audiences, while others appeared more frequently than protocol required. Conversations ceased when she entered rooms where they had been proceeding animatedly moments before. Palace officials who had previously treated her with elaborate courtesy now demonstrated perfunctory respect that barely concealed their impatience. Andronikos moved through the palace like smoke, appearing in doorways when least expected. His presence felt even when he remained invisible. Servants scurried to avoid his attention, while courtiers offered elaborate bows that barely concealed their terror. Agnes learned to recognize his footsteps in the corridors outside her chambers, measured, confident, belonging to a man who had never doubted his right to take whatever he desired. When he spoke to her, which he did increasingly often as Alexios grew weaker, his voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His conversations with Agnes began innocuously enough, appearing to represent nothing more than family interest in a young relative's welfare. He would inquire about her health, her studies, and her adjustment to Byzantine court life with paternal concern that would have seemed genuine to observers who did not notice how his eyes remained cold while his voice projected warmth. These encounters took place in public spaces where other palace inhabitants could witness his appropriate behavior, though Agnes sensed undercurrents that made her uncomfortable without providing clear reasons for her unease. Gradually, these conversations became more frequent and more personal. Andronikos would appear during her afternoon walks in the palace gardens, offering to explain the significance of various flowers and architectural features, with knowledge that demonstrated impressive erudition. He possessed the ability to make complex historical events sound like entertaining stories, describing the empire's past glories with detail that brought distant centuries to vivid life. Agnes found herself looking forward to these educational encounters, despite the vague anxiety they generated. His gifts began arriving shortly after these garden conversations became routine. Small items at first: a carved ivory comb decorated with scenes from classical mythology, a silk scarf whose patterns had been woven in workshops famous throughout the civilized world. books of hours illuminated by artists whose work decorated the private libraries of emperors and popes. Each gift arrived with brief notes written in Greek whose calligraphy demonstrated the elegant penmanship of someone trained in the most exclusive educational traditions. The palace itself seemed to shift around Agnes as power transferred from the dying boy emperor to his ambitious cousin. Servants who had once attended her eagerly began responding to her summons with reluctant delay. Guards who had bowed deeply started offering shallow nods.